This video is from portions of The Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. The PDF is linked in the description box in the comment section below. The special physical organ of perception is the brain, and perception is located in the aura of the pineal gland. This aura answers in vibrations to any impressions, but it can only be sensed, not perceived, in the living man. During the process of thought, manifesting in consciousness, a constant vibration occurs in the light of this aura, and a clairvoyant, looking at the brain of the living, may almost count and see the spiritual eye, the 7 scales, the 7 shades of light that are passing from the dullest into the brightest. When you touch your hand, before you touch it, the vibration is already in the aura of the pineal gland, and it has its own shade of color. It is this aura which causes the wear and tear of the organ by the vibrations that it is set up. The brain, when set vibrating, conveys the vibrations to the spinal cord, and so to the rest of the body. Happiness as well as sorrow sets up these strong vibrations, and so wears out the body. Powerful vibrations of joy and of sorrow thus may kill the heart. The septenary disturbance and play of light around the pineal gland are reflected in the heart, or rather the aura of the heart, which vibrates and illumines the 7 brains of the heart, just as does the aura around the pineal gland. This is exoterically 4, but esoterically 7-leaved lotus, the Saptaparna, the cave of Buddha, with its 7 different compartments. The astral body and the ego. There is a difference between the nature and the essence of the astral body and the ego. The astral body is molecular, however etherealized it may be, but the ego is atomic, spiritual. The atoms are spiritual and are forever invisible on this plane. Molecules form around them, and they remain as the higher invisible principles of the molecules. The eyes are the most occult of our senses. If we close them, we pass to the mental plane. Stop all the senses, and we are entirely on a different plane. Individuality. If 12 people are smoking together, the smoke of their cigarettes may mingle, but the molecules of the smoke from each have an affinity for each other, and they remain distinct forever and ever, no matter how the whole mass may interblend. So a drop of water, though it fall into the ocean, retains its individuality. It has become a drop with a life of its own, like a man, and it cannot be annihilated. Any group of people would appear as a group in the astral light, but would not be permanent. But a group meeting to study occultism would cohere, and the impression would be more permanent. The higher and the more spiritual the affinity, the more permanent the cohesion. The lower manas, or the lower mind. The lower manas is an emanation from the higher manas, and is of the same nature as the higher. This nature can make no impression on this plane, nor receive any. An archangel having no experience would be senseless on this plane, and could neither give nor receive impressions. So the lower manas clothes itself with the essence of the astral light. This astral envelope shuts it out from the parent, except through the antakarana, which is its only salvation. Break this, and you become like an animal. Kama. Kama is the life. It is the essence of the blood. When this leaves the blood, the latter congeals. Prana is universal on this plane. It is in us, the vital principle, pranic rather than prana. Selfhood. Qualities determine the properties of, quote, selfhood, end quote. As for instance, 2 wolves that are placed in the same environment would probably not act differently. The field of consciousness of the higher ego is never reflected in the astral light. The auric envelope receives the impressions of both the higher and the lower manas, and it is the latter impressions that are also reflected in the astral light. Whereas the essence of all things spiritual, all that which reaches or is not rejected by the higher ego is not reflected in the astral light because it is on too low of a plane. But during the life of man, this essence, with a view to karmic ends, is impressed on the auric envelope, and after death and the separation of the principles, it is united with the universal mind. That is to say, those, quote, impressions, end quote, which are superior to even the devachanic plane, to await there karmically until the day when the ego is to be reincarnated. There are thus 3 sets of impressions which we may call the kamic, the devachanic, and the manasic, for the entities, no matter how high, must have their karmic rewards and punishments on earth. These spiritual impressions are made more or less on the brain, otherwise the lower ego would not be responsible. There are some impressions, however, received through the brain, which are not of our previous experience, and in the case of the adept, the brain is trained to retain these impressions. The reincarnating ray may, for convenience, be separated into 2 aspects. The lower kamic ego is scattered in the kamaloka, and the manasic part accomplishes its cycle and returns to the higher ego. It is, in reality, this higher ego which is, so to speak, punished and suffers. This is the true crucifixion of the Christos, the most abstruse but yet the most important mystery of occultism. All the cycle of our lives hangs upon it. It is indeed the higher ego that is the sufferer, for remember that the abstract consciousness of the higher personal consciousness will remain impressed on the ego, since it must be a part and parcel of its eternity. All of our grandest impressions are impressed on the higher ego, because they are of the same nature as itself. Patriotism and great actions and national service are not altogether good, from the point of view of the highest. To benefit a portion of humanity is good, but to do so at the expense of the rest is bad. Therefore, in patriotism, etc., the venom is present with the good. For though the inner essence of the higher ego is unsoilable, the outer garment may be soiled. Thus both the bad and the good of such thoughts and actions are impressed on the auric envelope, and the karma of the bad is taken up to the higher ego, though it is perfectly guiltless of it. Thus both sets of impressions after death scatter in the universal mind, and at reincarnation the ego sends out a ray which is itself into a new personality, and there it suffers. It suffers in the self-consciousness that it is created by its own accumulated experiences. Every one of our egos has the karma of past manvantaras, ages or cycles, behind, and there are 7 hierarchies of egos, some of which, the inferior tribes, may be said to be only just beginning this present cycle. The ego starts with divine consciousness, no past, no future, and no separation. It is long before realizing that it is itself. Only after many births does it begin to discern, by this collectively of experience, that it is individual. At the end of its cycle of reincarnation, it is still the same divine consciousness, but it has now become individualized self-consciousness. The feeling of responsibility is inspired by the presence of the light of the higher ego. As the ego in its cycle of rebirth becomes more and more individualized, it learns more and more by suffering to recognize its own responsibility, by which it finally gains self-consciousness, the consciousness of all egos of the whole universe. Absolute being, to have the idea or sensation of all this, must pass through all experience individually and not universally, so that when it returns it should be of the same omniscience as the universal mind, plus the memory of all that it has passed through. At that day, quote, be with us, end quote, every ego has to remember all the cycles of its past reincarnations from manvantaras. The ego comes in contact with this earth, all 7 principles become one, and it sees all that it has done therein. It sees the stream of its past reincarnations by a certain divine light. It sees all humanity at once, but still there is ever, as it were, a stream which is always the quote, I, end quote. We should therefore always endeavor to accentuate our responsibility. The higher ego is, as it were, a globe of pure divine light, a unit from a higher plane on which is no differentiation. Descending to a plane of differentiation, it emanates a ray, which it can only manifest through the personality, which is already differentiated. A portion of this ray, the lower mind or the lower manas, during life, may so crystallize itself and become one with Kama that it will remain assimilated with matter. That portion which retains its purity form Antakarana. The whole fate of an incarnation depends on whether Antakarana will be able to restrain the Kama manas or not, the lower mind. After death, the higher light, the Antakarana, which bears the impressions and memory of all good and mobile aspirations, assimilates itself with the higher ego. Then the bad is disassociated into space and comes back as bad karma, awaiting the personality. The feeling of responsibility is the beginning of wisdom, a proof that ahankara is beginning to fade out, the beginning of losing the sense of separateness. Please comment, like, and share so that more people have the opportunity to view this content. We'll continue on in the next video with perception, consciousness, and conversion out of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. Until then, love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.